Today, I'm very pleased to introduce a very distinguished panel of industry leaders. They're joining us from Montreal, Montevideo, Brussels, Beirut, and Sydney. Thomas Reinhardt, Managing Director of Airlines for Europe. Thank you, Thomas, for being here with us today. Abdul Wahab Tefaha, Secretary General of the Arab Air Carriers Organization. Ahlan Bik. Subhas Menon, Director General of the Asia Pacific Airlines Association. Thank you, Subhas, for joining us this morning or this evening for you. Gorsello Yelpo, Legal Director of the Latin American and Caribbean Air Transport Association. Bienvenido, Gonzalo. And finally, George Petsikas, Chair of the Industry Affairs Industry Council at IATA and Senior Director, Government and Industry Affairs at Air Transit. Nice to see you, George.
Good to be here.
This webinar will be about 90 minutes total. It'll be divided in two parts. In the first part of the webinar, we'll give approximately 7 minutes to our speakers to share their regional story, to share their insights with us. Then in the second part, we'll open the discussion. It's going to be an open and free discussion at the panel level. But of course, audience, you're most than welcome to send your questions. We'll be reading them and we'll really do our best to answer all of them. If for some reason we're not able to, we'll just take notes and we'll reply via email. So the idea of this webinar today is to bring together regional industry perspectives around the same table to discuss some of the most important issues of the day for the aviation industry. In other words, we're trying to put global engagement in practice this morning. In the past few months, our distinguished panelists have witnessed firsthand the institutional challenges, political bottlenecks, and market access risks brought by the pandemic. They've also witnessed the arrival of what I like to refer to as the new kid on the block, public health agencies and their experts. At Intervistas, we followed very closely the commercial, regulatory, and technological aspects of the COVID-19 crisis. We have built forecasting models and advised on recovery planning. Since the beginning, actually, of the pandemic, we've counted approximately 2,800 changes to entry requirements worldwide, all related to travel restrictions, of course, because of COVID. Now, looking into the future, we can definitely foresee a possible increase of health-related costs for airports and airlines. We also expect higher charges and fees for the aviation sector in general, of course, always based on local policy priorities. In the coming months, perhaps, in order to protect investments and new equities, governments may be tempted to control market access through a variety of legal and regulatory tools. As you know, the principle of reciprocity in international aviation is already being challenged on different fronts. So what's next? In terms of the notion of level playing field, for example, who knows? It may evolve to reflect a renewed appetite to defend the national interest in some cases, but of course, it all depends on local policy priorities. So, conclusion, a return to protectionism in the short term is quite possible. So, what are the lessons learned and political risks ahead for the global aviation industry? What are the collaboration models that we can get out of this crisis based on the regional experience that our speakers will share with us today? And most importantly, and perhaps this is more like a long-term question, but a quite crucial one, the international legal order based on the Chicago Convention has been increasingly challenged recently because of geopolitics. And we have to find a way to strengthen our international institutions as well. These are some of the questions that I'd like to discuss today with our distinguished panel. And let me introduce our first speaker, Thomas Reinhardt, Managing Director of Airlines for Europe. Thomas, let me start with one question for you. From a European perspective, do you think we can reconcile regional and national interests on one side and global cooperation? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Marcelo, and thanks for having me on the panel today. Yes, I think the crisis clearly has shown in Europe that Europe could be a little bit more Europe than it has actually shown for the past year and a half since the crisis started. I mean, from an A4E perspective, to start with, we completely had to revisit our priorities. All of a sudden, we were dealing with many more operational priorities than before. It was not just about policy. It was really everything we did was focused on how can we help our members, to fly again as soon as possible. And I think Europe has done I'd say, relatively good job in terms of prepping the field from a technical perspective. A good example, I think, is the European Commission's initiative to launch the digital COVID certificate, which is basically a digital COVID pass, an app, which allows you or authorities to a QR code identify whether you have been vaccinated, or if not, whether you're immune to COVID-19, or whether you are negative following a test, PCR test, or an antigen test. So there's been some criticism on the European Commission on, for instance, when you look at the purchasing programs for the vaccination, the vaccines that are around. I think it's a criticism which is not entirely, I think, fair. I do think that what we've seen in Europe is that where the Commission has the competences, so the technical competences from an airspace operational perspective, for instance, competences from a slots regulation perspective, that the European Commission has actually done a very good job, and we've worked very closely with them. I think where we've seen the flaw again of Europe, because many people outside of the European region think that Europe or the European Union, 27 member states, is one strong unity. Well, there are a couple of areas, like public health, for instance, which are not an EU competence, which means that the European Commission and the Brussels-based institutions are basically quite weak in terms of bringing out binding legislation. So whatever comes out of Brussels for public health related aspects, such as COVID-19, the pandemic, and other kinds of diseases they would like to keep under control, the European Commission has a non-binding power, so can only provide recommendations. And that means that for airlines, it was quite frustrating until today that even though the EU would come out with a good initiative like the digital COVID certificate I just mentioned, the implementation of this certificate at the end of the day will need to be checked and actually implemented by the ministers of health. So it's the health people calling the shots from the policy side, but also from the implementation side. And so you see automatically that the airports and the airlines have had for the last, since the crisis started, a huge issue, though even some of the travel restrictions were eased. From an administrative perspective and from getting passengers moving again, it's been really a nightmare to do that. So even though travel restrictions had been eased because of the digital certificate pass, you see that national governments and local authorities still were able to implement their own measures on top of the European measures, which were the European measures, by the way, which made perfect sense and which are actually the result of discussions with stakeholders like airports and airlines and air navigation service providers. So the lessons learned, I would say, looking at COVID-19 from a European perspective would be, let's give Europe the powers next time when this happens again. I mean, we have a lot of experience now, both at the EU and national level. We know what works, we know what doesn't work. But it would be good if Europe would get the legal competences and the political push to take it on as an additional competence. Without that, I'm afraid that everyone says we will see more of these pandemics going forward. Unfortunately, airlines and I think airports are very well prepared to handle the crisis. In principle, we're very resilient and very flexible to deal with these types of crises, but if the national governments keep on preventing us from doing the right thing based on scientific data, then we have a problem. So we need a coordinated approach amongst the states And we need someone up there called Europe saying, this is how he's going to do it, and we need to implement it. So I think that's probably a first answer to your question. The second big challenge, I think, which we see crossing the crisis that we have been facing, are still facing, because we are only starting to recover this summer, we all hope, also in Europe, is the challenge of sustainability, and more particularly, how can we continue to reduce CO2 emissions? And Europe, I think, as my colleagues on the panel know, Europe has always wanted to be on the forefront of, in terms of how to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And CO2 is, of course, looking at the Paris Agreement, is, of course, the main topic, CO2 emissions. Of course, we're in aviation, we need to look at other emissions as well. And we've really had to deal with a political, with a lot of bashing of aviation in Europe. And it's gotten really up to the political agenda, very high up at all levels across all political parties. And people today are really convinced that aviation is really, really bad for the environment. It's polluting. We all know, the experts, that that's not the fact. That's not true. That global aviations, or that CO2 emissions, talking about aviation, is only responsible for 2 to 3% worldwide, and between 3 and 4% in Europe. But we had to do a lot of work in Brussels, but also at national level, to get this right. And this is where I think Europe as a region, I think, fortunately, was able to make one front with the input of industry. And I think Europe there has a role, and will have a role, to take the commitments that European airlines have taken in Europe with Destination 2050, which means basically going to net zero. We're committed to going to net zero in terms of CO2 emissions by 2050, which is in line with the European overall objective on reducing CO2 emissions, to taking that commitment from European aviation sector internationally. So I'm talking ICAO, I'm talking, of course, the impact of negotiations and the further implementation of CORSIA, which many people in Europe believe is not working and may not work. So as A4E, we are very strong supporters of CORSIA, and we're trying to use, or make sure, that European diplomacy at the global level will help us to improve things like CORSIA. So, because this is a global issue we need to tackle globally. And in the meantime, European airlines, yes, we are committed to taking measures regionally to reduce CO2 emissions. There is really no way back. And right now we're looking at how to make this happen, both within the appropriate regulatory framework, which we still don't have. I'm talking about, availability of SAFs. I'm talking about sufficient funding and subsidies to develop new technologies. I'm talking about single European sky, making ATC much more efficient, which is really, more efficient ATM is really low-hanging fruit. It's the most cost-efficient way to reduce CO2 emissions. And so national governments cannot get their act together on forming a European airspace. So we're really using the overall political pressure to put pressure on national politicians to help us with a green agenda. That, I think, gives you a flavor of the two items. First of all, get people flying again, trying to reduce or get rid of the COVID-19 travel restrictions, because we have a digital pass, because close to, very soon 70% of EU population will be vaccinated. So there's no reason for travel restrictions on the one hand. And on the other hand, a challenge that we will carry with us, during and after the crisis for quite a while, is the challenge of sustainability. And we need to tackle it locally, regionally, and also globally. That's quite clear. Maybe I want to stop here.
Thank you for your remarks, Thomas. I take note that you seem to put together coordination. This coordination, or the effectiveness of coordination going forward, is a question of competencies. I think this is a very, very interesting questions that I'd like to explore with our panel later on during the discussion. But then I'll introduce our second panelist, Subhas Menon, who's the Director General of the Association of Asia Pacific Airlines. And again, Subhas, a quick question to kickstart our discussion. It seems like fragmentation and bilateralism is the new normal in your region. Can you expand perhaps a bit more on this issue?
Thank you, Marcelo. I'm very glad to be here. Unlike Europe, there is no distinct regional political institution in Asia. Asia is vastly diverse in terms of population, in terms of size, in terms of culture, income, and politics. But generally, governments in Asia have kept their own counsel, and they don't brook being told what to do from the outside. So this attitude has been exacerbated by COVID-19. Politicians defer to the public health experts who are completely risk averse. You don't see any evidence of risk assessment. It's a completely elimination strategy, and this is compounded by the fact that the world is still learning about this virus. So as they say, in the land of the blind, the one-eyed Jack is king. So it is complete isolation and nationalism, is what is plaguing the Asia Pacific region. Of course, airlines are in crisis, but this is not a crisis of their making. Um, those airlines, who have shareholders or governments with deep pockets are fine, but others, they have to find innovative solutions, to get around the problem. The main problem, is cost, especially debt servicing cost. In America, they have Chapter 11. In Asia, there's no such instrument. So they have to go where the applicable law is available, courts in other places, basically to try and reduce their costs, especially their debt servicing costs. But the good thing is that the airlines are around, and they are making ends meet, not fully, but at least to survive with cargo and cost abatement. Cargo demand actually is already exceeded the 2019 levels. Domestic demand is coming close to 2019, but international traffic, that's where the problem is. It is completely decimated. It's less than 5% of what it used to be in 2019. Of course, the Asia Pacific region was the greatest growing region, but now it is the fastest falling region. It is still the largest, accounting for 38% of the entire aviation market. I suppose you could say that 2 years is not a big dent in the scheme of things, and recovery is possible. But I think what is very important, is for travel and tourism to be prioritized. At the moment, travel and tourism is not prioritized. So what do you get? Families are stranded. I thought freedom to travel is now a basic human right, but that is gone, and there's a loss of mobility. Of course, international organizations are important. ICAO, WHO, they are doing their part. They can only set the tone. They can provide the framework. Ultimately, it depends on states. And what have you? Even WHO's advice is not being followed or heeded by the public health experts. As regional associations, what can we do? Yes, we can advocate for the airlines' needs to be addressed. We can advocate for regulations to be eased. But ultimately, governments call the shots. What we have seen is that they are prioritizing other aspects of the economy, local economy, rather than international travel. Of course, governments and the industry have been working together to provide some level of stability as far as the financial and regulatory requirements are for airlines, even helping to keep jobs. But we should take the momentum from this and kick on from here. And prioritize tourism. It is important to restore air connectivity, and very importantly, airlines must survive if consumer rights have to be protected. So that is the way forward, I think. There might be consolidation in the industry, but that's not the priority for airlines. It might happen through attrition. But at the end of the day, I think prioritizing travel and tourism is very important for the Asia Pacific region. I think tourism, trade, and travel is the lifeblood, for the economic and emotional well-being of the Asia Pacific population. So this is very important. You can see that in the Asia Pacific region, there's no such thing as border diplomacy or regionalization policies. That is a first world issue, really. Travel and tourism is a very important part of Asia, and you see how they are trying to do whatever they can to get things kick-started. Thailand has introduced the sandbox concept, for vaccinated travelers to travel to Phuket. Indonesia has created a bubble around Bali, for foreign tourists to go to. Singapore is actively pursuing travel bubbles. Japan is going to hold the Olympics, and they're also trying to encourage business travel through travel corridors, So they're doing whatever they can, to try and bring the traffic along. But at the moment, I think bilateral agreement seems to be the way to go. Travel bubbles, because there's a multiplicity of restrictions, health and travel restrictions. Only way to get around it, to clarify and coordinate all these requirements, is bilaterally through travel bubbles. But how long is it going to take, for travel bubbles to restore global connectivity? I think forever. Maybe post-pandemic we may have to have a Chicago Convention 2 for the freedoms of the air. So yeah, it is a nightmare. And travel bubbles, which are stops and starts, do not provide much confidence for the traveler. What we need is really global framework for travel and health protocols. Of course, G20 is good, better than G7 or G2, but what we really need is a multilateral framework, and recovery cannot happen if travel is only going to take place among a few rich countries, or only, for people who have been, few people who have been vaccinated. So we need a more, what should I say, a universal application of policy. I think what has happened is that the leadership in aviation has been sort of lost or suspended, for the time being, and I must say the European Union is probably one of the few, showing some leadership, in terms of coming up with the risk assessment strategy, as well as a global framework, for reopening borders, and in the context of this, I would like to mention that the ASEAN European Union comprehensive air transport agreement that was negotiated a few weeks ago is definitely a step in the right direction. It is providing optimism, a shot in the arm, forgive me the pun, to the air transport industry. We talked about the environment, sustainability. I think the Asian countries have made great strides, especially by embracing CORSIA throughout the region. So that is already in place, a feather in the cap for the industry, and also is working hard to meet the long-term sustainability goal of the industry. But two things are very important. I think all parties, all stakeholders in the aviation ecosystem must share the burden, and not just leave it to airlines, to meet these goals. And secondly, I think it is also very important that a growth should not be stifled. I think at the end of the day, it is the Asia Pacific's turn to grow. So we should not be stifled. I think I'll stop there. Thank you, Marcelo.
Thank you, Subhas. How are you? Thank you so much for your remarks. There's one question that perhaps I'd like to discuss later on. In your region, we have China, Australia playing their own game. And one of the questions that popped up last night when I was preparing the notes for today was, well, what's the level playing field for your member airlines post-COVID-19? but we can get to it later on during our discussion. Our next panelist is Gorsello Yelpo, Legal Director of the Latin American and Caribbean Air Transport Association. His region is currently one of the most affected by COVID-19 in terms of cases per capita, and 3 of the most important airlines in the region have filed for Chapter 11, although I hear that they're coming out of it in the next few months. Aeromexico, Aviation, and Latam. So, Gonzalo, from your regional perspective, do you foresee any risks of protectionism or misguided regulatory initiatives that will actually slow down even further the process of recovery?
Thank you, Marcelo, for your questions. Thank you, firstly, for putting this webinar together. I would like to thank as well the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy and Intervistas. Well, your question about misguided or in a certain way not smart regulation, as IATA likes to say, promoting the smart regulation, is something that we are here in the Latin American and Caribbean region. We are facing, in a certain way, with pushes, regular pushes from each of the regulatory bodies. It doesn't change with this environment doesn't change with the pandemic. As we say, usually our job is to prevent damages instead of promoting regulation. That is, we would like to be more on the side of promoting regulation rather than preventing damages. And the story of the region at this point is one of those that you would say that in 2019, we are looking at 16 continued growth years. We were expecting a 5% growth for 2020, and suddenly everything stopped. We are seeing that against April 2021 versus April 2019, we are seeing a drop of almost 62% in traffic, driven almost by an 80% of slow of traffic in international, 46% in short in domestic. And this is due also, the numbers are not worse because Brazil and Mexico, 2 of the biggest countries in the region with almost 50% of the transportation in regular years, they didn't stop. They didn't stop at all. So imagine the situation in the other countries, in the rest of the countries of the region. We have countries that have stopped all inclusive with the domestic transportation, in which there were certain limitations for passengers to move to one city to another. So on the other side, we've seen that the aids that were asked for the industry by the industry to the governments in the Latin American and Caribbean, they have reached in small drops, we could say, with less than 1% of the total aids in the world. So given the fact that most of the airlines in the international transportation face competition with airlines from within the region, but mostly from the regions that have received more aids, there is a trend, or we could say not a trend, we could say some ideas of stepping back on the opening that we are seeing in the past years. Certain countries we are seeing that they have limited the number of passengers to a certain amount per day, and also that would say if you distribute evenly those passengers, at least you would say, well, it could make sense. You have a certain restriction, okay, it's even for everyone, but they are giving those seats in a strange way or with strange concepts about reciprocity. We are seeing also conversations on the pre-installation of subsidies. And if these subsidies, the problem with this is once you start giving this away without, we need this to be transparent, firstly, and then to be distributed evenly, or in an intelligent way. If you go with these subsidies or exemptions in a way that all transport all carriers are not treated equally, then market distortions comes to play. Also, we are seeing in certain cases the temptation to government stepping into the airlines as well, with capital, with intervention, but in a general way, I would say that this could be for 1 or 2 years. Latin America has been, I think, in many manners, has been an example of consolidation, of adopting new ways of approaching these nationality clauses. We've seen the biggest groups of airlines developing in a healthy way, such as in the first time with TACA, then with Avianca, merging those two carriers, LATAM Airlines with a multiple flags. So the region is in a certain way an example. We could see some steps back because of the pandemic, but I think that the trend of consolidation and liberalization is here to stay in the region. So I could say that regarding to your question, yes, we can see some trends to protect for a limited time. I think it's not something that I think there is a strong consensus everywhere that competition has been good for the air transportation. That is something that is a general consensus when we speak with the Latin American Civil Aviation Commission. They are clear on this. For example, they have promoted a specific instrument for seventh freedom in air cargo. It has been proven to be successful. 10 countries entered into it. Is for intra-regional air cargo transportation. This has been very effective, and so there is a movement towards liberalization. However, we still have those countries that might think in a different way, but this is something that is not new. We have seen that in the past with, for example, with Argentina, with a protective policy towards its carrier. We can't say anything about it. There are other countries in the world that have a national flag carrier that is somehow promoted. They have a vast country to cover every type of routes, even those that are not profitable. So if that is the way, okay, we can provide guidance on how to do it in the best manner, but that is something that happens. But in general terms, we see that temptation could be there, but it's not something that strong. The other consideration is on the political terms in general. There is discontent in general terms in the population with the health responses from the government, with the vaccination that as you know, Latin America and the Caribbean is far behind in many cases. So this political unrest gives uncertainty for all the industries, including the aviation, and that could bring some problems in long-term investment, in long-term projects. And I see that Thomas and Subas have mentioned Corsia, for example, and we know that the implementation of SAF is something very important to achieve the aspirational goals. And if we don't see, if the countries of the region don't give political and legal certainty, these countries will not receive those investments, and that is going to be a strong disincentive for the industry to achieve those goals. So it's a mixture of things, and the challenges are mostly on the political side, indeed.
Thank you, Gonzalo, for your remarks as well. We'll get back to some questions. I see here you mentioned a bit of a stepping back in open skies, temporary for now, but I think it'll be interesting as well, because I'm assuming you're referring to the Argentinian case with the 2,000 seats per day. So I'm curious to see if there's been tendencies in other countries to do that as well, to keep control on the pandemic and people coming in and out. Our next panelist has been a very influential player in asserting the aeropolitical role of Middle Eastern carriers in global aviation. Mr. Abdul Wahab Tefaha, Secretary General of the Arab Air Carriers Organization. Mr. Tefaha, if we start from the assumption that public agencies are here to stay as a stakeholder in aviation matters, is there any hope for global harmonization according to you, and what's been your experience interacting with public agencies in your region?
I mean, one word can describe that experience: nightmare. Basically, what is happening not only in the region, but across the world, even in Europe, even with the presence of the EU, like Thomas said, it's about national authorities who are deciding whether they adopt or not adopt, or whatever the considerations would be for them, in their view, the best way to deal with the pandemic. The very unfortunate thing that happened is that we were all taken by surprise, because the last pandemic actually happened more than 100 years ago. And the national health authorities dealt with it exactly the same way they dealt with it 100 years ago. So the very first thing you do, what do you do? Quarantine, lockdown, restrictions, and so on and so forth. They were reading from the same playbook that was written hundreds and hundreds of years ago, when sail ships used to come and they had an infection somehow on board. They used to fly the yellow flag, and then they would have to stay outside the port for 40 days. And this is hence the name quarantine. And either everybody on the ship would die or they recover and then they would be able to come in. Now they applied that to aviation. They applied that to travel across border. And the biggest problem is that we have been spending, or the world has been spending, the last 76 years in building transnational and multinational institutions, the UN, ICAO, WHO, and other regional bodies and so on. And they spent a lot of money building those institutions and empowering those institutions. But the end result of that, those institutions, when it really came to pass something that you needed international bodies to step in, to say what is best to handle a global event, nobody listened to them. And I don't blame ICAO or WHO or the UN agencies, no, because they have tried their best to try to influence the national authorities in order to listen to reason and to apply risk management and to apply sensible ways of handling the pandemic in a way that does not increase the exposure to the pandemic, and on the other, that does not really stop the wheels of the economy from turning. But unfortunately, maybe it's something a little bit impolite to say, but I would say it anyway. Usually health authorities are very much national concern, and whoever in charge of a national authority is really something who's a local figure, and nobody really mentions them in news and media and so on. Suddenly they have become the center of gravity, the center of the universe for every country in the world. And I'm afraid some of them are enjoying that 15 minutes of fame. And they are enjoying that they have the lock and key for the economy of the country, for the entry into the country. And that power is really got to their heads. So we are in a catch-22 situation. There are the international organizations, the regional organizations, and the associations. They have done what they can in order to produce guidelines to instill a little bit of harmony and transparency and clarity and how to deal with the pandemic in a sensible and smart way, rather than to jump on the defensive and say we close everything so that nothing will happen. And funny enough, countries which closed their borders had the highest level of infections, which should have told them that it's not about closing the borders, it's about social responsibility by individuals. And this is what it matters. Instead of instilling and trying to police that type of social responsibility, actually it became a political issue. And in many countries, it became something that, it's freedom against oppression. Anyway, this is what happened. And the end result is more than 3 million dead and economies which are in tatters. As far as the impact on the region, we used to compete with Asia Pacific in terms of which one is growing faster. Now we are competing with Asia Pacific, which one is declining faster, actually. Probably we, Subhas, I think we are the heroes there, because our decline is the highest, is the lowest in the world. I don't know the way you look at it, from upside down or down up. So now the only way to deal with national authorities, national health authorities, I hope that they will not continue to be players, because you said they are the new kid on the block. I hope that this terminology is going to expire very soon. I think by the end of 2022, nobody is going to hear about health authorities anymore, because we would have defeated, in most cases, the pandemic, at least in the major travel markets, and they will be relegated back to their own important work, yet mundane. The way we deal with it in the meantime is that through individual national authorities, to try to convince them. This is what we are doing. This is our experience, to try to convince them one by one to follow what is sensible, to follow guidelines, to follow harmony, and to follow transparency in the policy making, to be more scientific than fearing from blame. This is as far as dealing with the health authorities. Their impact on the near future is going to continue. Luckily, we have the likes of the EU who were, avant-garde to the extent that they were able to produce something for the whole region. And I can see now that more and more countries are following the guidelines of the EU and opening up their markets. I hope there won't be third or a fourth wave that will crash all that effort down. I'm hopeful that it's not going to happen, but this is the only way to deal with the national health authorities, the new kid on the block, which I hope that they will not last long in this block. On a different front, on whether we are going to actually be facing some retraction to the ways of protectionism. Yes, I can see that under the label of health, some of the governments, some of the stakeholders are trying to take advantage of the current situation and to improve their competitive situation by, shielding themselves from competition. I don't think this game can be played too long because the pressure of the traveling public, the pressure of the globality of the aviation industry, the globality of trade, that will culminate in restoring normalcy to the aviation. So I'm not too afraid of having this neo-protectionism reigning for far, because as I said, the travelers, they are interconnected already, and they have been interconnected only a year and a half ago, and now and they still remember the freedom of travel, freedom of movement. What does it mean to them? And they will demand from their politicians to go back to normalcy, even though some politicians will try to be a little bit too restrictive under different banners. As far as the what we believe that the main issues we need to address in the near future, I believe some of them were mentioned by Thomas, Gonzalo, and Subas. But I would like to repeat, number one is resilience. I mean, this industry, yes, it is resilient, but it needs help nowadays in order to be resilient up till the end, or until we go out of this tunnel. Secondly, restoration to normalcy, restoration to where we were in 2019. The third one is sustainability through balanced but ambitious CO2 abatement. Thomas and Gonzalo mentioned the issue of climate change. We have it very much on the agenda, and we believe that aviation is going to be demanded to be more ambitious than the long-term goal that the aviation has set for itself by 2050. I believe the grounds are ready to have zero net emissions by 2050, provided that all the stakeholders play their part. Thomas mentioned the governments, infrastructure providers. If they just sit back and do nothing, we are not going to achieve zero net emissions. If the technology partners do not provide paradigm shifts and the technology they are providing in propulsion and airframe, we will not be able to achieve zero net emissions. If the fuel suppliers and other sustainable fuel suppliers do not provide enough quantities for commercialization of the SAF, we will not be able to achieve zero net emission. And here I would like to mention, also go back to the role of the governments. Governments should incentivize using SAF. On the, if they are really subscribing to the climate, to the abatement of the CO2 emissions, they need to incentivize, not to mandate, a different way of paying taxes and making travel even more expensive. So these are, they are the global issues, but they are also the issues that we believe that we are committed to address during the next period. Most importantly, we are committed to pick up where we left off in 2019, to push the envelope of more freedom and market access, to push the envelope in more freedom of movement of people and to push the envelope in more freedom of trading. Because if there is one thing that, or the silver lining in this pandemic, it showed everybody that we don't live in isolated islands and countries. We live in one world. And all of these flags, borders are all artificial. And this is why we should go back to what we are. Human species, social species, which are meant to interconnect. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tefaha. I like that closing there. We're human species and we're social species as well. And I fully agree with that. You said a lot of interesting things here about freedom, about sustainability, about resilience, and we'll get back to those topics in our open discussion. Now we have our last panelist, George Petsikas, who's based in Montreal, chair of the Industry Affairs Advisory Council at IATA. And George, just a couple of questions. Congrats, by the way. Montreal Canadiens are doing very well. Seems that they might go into the finals, right? The NHL. So talking about, public health agencies and the way the industry has been interacting with them in the past few months, and governments choosing to protect their local populations, can we really blame them to respond to the people who elected them? Floor is yours. I think you're on mute.
Yeah. I committed the sin that we all commit, which of course forget that we're on. Thank you, Marcelo. I appreciate the invitation today, Institute of Peace and Diplomacy, and of course this distinguished panel. By the way, Gonzalo, I don't know what you're drinking, but it looks pretty good. One of the luxuries about going last is that I can always just say, I agree with my distinguished colleagues. Let's go have a drink and watch a hockey game. But you know what? I will add a few thoughts. Look, to your direct question, I'm wearing 3 hats today. All right, and that's a good thing because, of course, my hair is falling out. But I actually work for an airline. That's my day-to-day job, and of course, that, excuse the pun, keeps me grounded in many ways in terms of challenging and dealing with the major challenges that we have on a day-to-day basis right now in this context that sometimes we forget about as quote-unquote lobbyists at the higher level, talking policies and spouting data and all that sort of stuff. I'm also the token North American here, of course, as you mentioned, with emphasis on Canada, where I'm based and I work. And I can talk to you a little bit about some of the challenges we've had in one of the most restrictive travel jurisdictions of the world right now. And of course, internationally, as you mentioned, a lot of the thoughts that were mentioned here about the institutions and how we move forward on that basis. So first, I work for an airline that's been grounded since last January, all right? We, pre-pandemic, were the 3rd largest airline in Canada, after Air Canada and WestJet, and 2nd largest internationally. I've said goodbye to almost 2,500 of my colleagues over the last year and a half. And clearly, our airline today is in a situation where we are at a crossroads to see how we're going to move forward. Thankfully, we have been very resilient. Thankfully, we have a little bit of a lifeline that's been provided to us by the Government of Canada, not a state subsidy, but clearly a lifeline. And of course, in the longer term, we need to look about how to re-engineer ourselves. Like the old saying goes, never waste a good crisis in terms of opportunities it presents. And this is something that we are focused on. I think it's going to be important for a lot of airlines in this world to refocus and to use this opportunity to build back better. I'm sorry about the cliche festival this morning, colleagues, but it is true. This is an opportunity. It is hard. It is sad, as I just mentioned, but it's an opportunity for the industry. And I think we need desperately to look inside and see how we can do and come back better. And clearly, my company will be back. We have a strategy. We are going to start again on August the 1st. We're going to be stronger, better, more focused than ever. So just watch for us, guys. We'll be back. Now, in Canada, as I mentioned, Marcelo, you asked the question about the public health authorities' interaction in terms of policies and how that's impacted us. And, Abdulwahab, I'm not sure I share your optimism about when we say the pandemic will be a bad memory back in 2022. Unfortunately, when you speak to the experts, the epidemiologists and the rest of them, they will always say, we will never completely get rid of this thing, guys. It will remain endemic. We are unfortunately seeing mutations every day. This is part of the problem now with global pandemics. They are not easily stamped out. So we need to keep dealing with those challenges. And right now, I'm in a jurisdiction where the government has basically, as we've said earlier on, I think it was Subhas who talked about zero risk mentality by the public health authorities. And of course, our business, aviation, by definition, was never zero risk. There's no zero risk unless you hide under your bed and have, the drink that Gonzalo's having here and relaxing under your bed and hiding. There's no zero risk. There was always risk managed. And the issue now becomes, are decisions and policies here being made on the basis of scientific evidence-based risk approach, or are they unfortunately being, quote unquote, infected by other considerations and matters, including political and electoral considerations? This is unfortunately a little bit of the problem we're having here in Canada. I don't want to start pointing fingers. Our government has done things well. I don't want to, and I know there are probably a lot of government colleagues that may be listening here in Canada who I work with. I have a lot of respect. Public service has done a very, very great job here. And you know what? We're doing great in a lot of our parts of our country here. We're really, really beating this thing. And our vaccination per capita rate is the highest right now in the world, surprisingly enough. We were laggards a few months ago. We are now doing fantastic. And the government has said vaccination is the solution. We have said that's great. Let's leverage that solution. And let's talk about the roadmap to reopening and recovery. That's where we've sort of, run into this problem here in terms of the interaction between the public health guys who continue to say, listen, I got variants out there. Yes, my vaccination rates are good, but these things can flare up, blah, 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 blah. I want zero risk, basically, or almost zero risk. Well, we pay politicians, well, at least in our country, in our governance system, and we elect them to make decisions based on a balance of considerations and interests. The overall public interest has to have a balance that's informing those policy decisions. Yes, of course, we all want to stay safe. And of course, we want to protect our families and we want to stay healthy. Everybody agrees with this. The question now becomes, as we move through with the solution and executing on it, which is vaccination, how do we rebalance a lot of these policy decisions and considerations to remind everybody that as an industry globally, okay, we are not an afterthought here, folks. We weren't selling refrigerators, with all due respect to people who build refrigerators and sell them. We were supporting a global transportation network that pre-pandemic enabled over 65 million jobs in travel and tourism, almost $2.5 trillion in GDP, and of course, supported national export policies, trade and commerce, and of course, tourism. As we said before, my company is Leisure Holiday Airline. Believe me, tourism is huge. And that's why one of the problems, of course, why we couldn't fly for the last few months, because of the impact on tourism and on discretionary travel. So the question is, how do we get the public health authorities to sort of buy in to the fact that we are no longer part of the problem, but can be part of the solution long term? And again, this is going to be endemic. I wish everybody would say it's going to be a bad memory in 2022. It won't be. This is like 9/11. The security guys didn't go away. The security policy guys didn't go away a year after 9/11. They were still there, and they were still moving along, chugging along with a lot of their agenda in terms of enhancing aviation security, some of which was fine and it added value, some of which we saw obviously didn't work, and we want to make sure we don't get stuck into that vicious circle here in terms of the public health measures. But we need to remember one thing, internationally, globally, the medical guys, right? By the way, if you took a survey about, all the chief public health officers in the world and you told them, what do you know about ICAO? Have you ever heard of it? I believe 96% would say, is that a dessert that we order at our local coffee bar? I don't know. I've never heard of ICAO. What is that? And of course, you can't blame them because, of course, it didn't involve them before. Now they're very much involved in all these issues. We were seen as the problem. We were seen as the enabler of the transmission globally. We were seen as the facilitators, the vectors. We didn't do it on purpose, of course, but because of what we did, which was a great thing pre-pandemic, which is like Abdul Wahab said, we are a global village because of aviation in the last 80, 90 years, guys. We are no longer little settlements split apart around the world here. We can go from one end of the world to the other and enjoy cultures and the rich, rich cultural heritage of our planet and other, languages because of aviation, folks. You can't take a bus to Asia from Montreal. So the bottom line is that what was our strength became our weakness here, because now we were seen as the bad guys who are really making this thing really, really worse. So shut them down, guys. Shut them down. Job one, we need to restore our credibility as guys who are not going to be facilitators of this thing anymore, whatever might happen in the future, whether or not we might see flare-ups of variants or whatever. We need to be credible in the sense that we ourselves, in terms of our aircraft cabins and our procedures at airports, are not vectors and sources of future transmission. That's job one. And I think IATA clearly has taken a great lead on that. We've seen all these things over the last year and a half. We've seen the studies about cabin air, which is much safer than sitting in a barbershop getting your hair cut these days. All the sorts of things that are good. But we also need our institutions like ICAO and the rest of them to come to the table with solutions on better communications, better early warning systems, guys. Yes, everybody has national self-interest. That's something that has existed for since millennia, centuries, and will continue to exist, and certainly nothing changed here. But we have to go beyond that, of course, and we need our institutions, such as ICAO and the WHO, to lead on ways that can go to these national public health guys and say, listen, we have ways to ensure, right, that we don't flare this thing up again or make it even worse in the future, all right? Because we all agree, guys, once it's transmitting in a community, the scientists all agree, there's no point in closing borders, guys, because it's just gonna keep, it's just keep going. And that's what we're telling our government here in Canada. Again, our government is taking a zero or nearly zero risk approach right now in terms of international borders, which, we don't really agree with because we don't believe it's following the science-based recommendations that they got from a panel of medical experts just a few weeks ago. The hotel quarantines, nobody said that made any sense in terms of enhancing or adding value to public safety, public health and safety. But what is very clear is that we need to be part of the solution and not the problem as we move forward here. Our institutions are only as effective as the amount of credibility that their member states are prepared to give them. And we need to see, obviously, ICAO step up now. The old joke, and again, lots of friends at ICAO, and they're great, dedicated people. The old joke, pre-pandemic was, ICAO is on the ball on issues that are absolutely critical to aviation and the commercial airline industry 5 years ago. We can't afford that anymore. All right, that's a silly little joke, but we can't afford that anymore. I'm looking forward to Juan Carlos Salazar, who I think we all know, taking the helm in August. I think he hopefully will bring renewed energy to that institution and renewed focus, because this is what we're going to need, okay? The doctors will not stand down, guys, in the near future. They're not gonna go back to their labs or their hospitals or prescribing hemorrhoid creams, guys. They're not gonna do that. They are still going to be advising and telling a lot of politicians, a lot of ministers who are making decisions, oh, you better be careful now because this thing can flare up. And well, we need the other side of the coin, which is to come with robust solutions. Robust means, and that goes also to, we talked about the vaccine certificates before, the digital passport, the green passport in Europe. This is going to be critical. This is one of the things where unfortunately Canada is lagging behind. How are we going to support the system? How are we going to have people lining up, having their paper vaccine certificates scanned, and it doesn't work, and okay, then let's put this in This is going to be a mess. Of course, ICAO, of course, WHO has to work with that. We announced the other day in Canada that vaccinated travelers will be exempt from the quarantine requirements on proof, of course, fully vaccinated on proof of full vaccination. But only 4 vaccines count, the ones we've approved here in Canada. Well, that's going to be a bit of a problem because there are a lot of other vaccines that are being approved elsewhere, and people will be traveling with them. And of course, again, we need ICAO and WHO to step up here with real solutions to say, here's how we support your risk management at the borders, countries, in terms of ensuring these folks are fully vaccinated. And I'm afraid we're behind the ball on this right now. And of course, IATA is pushing hard with Travel Pass, which of course is a turnkey solution for aviation cross-border travel. All sorts of guys are out there, selling their apps these days. Canada announced that they're going to use their government app, ArriveCan for vaccine. That's great, guys. But we need to get an interoperable and integrated solution out there for international cross-border travel. So
George, on that question of the digital travel certificates, right? Like we have the European example, we have the app here in Canada. Now, on that aspect, right? Like there's been different approaches right now that regions or countries have shared. Some countries are saying, you're vaccinated or no way, you're not getting into my country. Some regions like the Europeans, they're taking a more risk-based approach where they have different layers and people can actually move around if they've been tested. So, and this is my question for the group right now. Despite the promises that these digital travel solutions are promising to as a way forward for the industry, don't you think that the arrival of these digital travel solutions will actually open up new questions, such as what type of vaccine are considered as within the definition, like they did in Canada, as fully vaccinated? Chinese vaccines are not recognized. The Russian vaccine is not recognized. Retaliation, that front, but also the idea that different countries, like they did during the pandemic, they will adopt different risk management approaches for this as well. So it'll become another tool to block the borders yet again. So I'm curious to know what our panelists think about this question. Maybe we can start with Mr. Tefaha. I think you had raised your hand earlier.
Yes, actually, responding to your question, I don't think we will reach a panacea where everybody is going to be to recognize everybody else, or and let's face it, some of the decisions that are being taken today are not 100% health-based. Some of them, and I don't know, I'm presuming here, some of them may be influenced by either political considerations or inability to get full access to the data behind the vaccine. And this is why even the WHO is not accrediting all the vaccines that have been out there, particularly the Sputnik 5. But all the other vaccines are accredited. I don't think we will reach panacea and consensus about that. But what I believe will happen is that by the end of 2022, and this is the source of my optimism, by the end of 2022, in between the economic pressure, the spread of vaccination, the spread of recovery, because let's not forget that the recovered people have an immunity for a certain amount of time. The pandemic, as we've been surprised by it and caught, off guard, is going to change course into something familiar. Again, let's not forget what happened in the previous pandemics, not the Spanish flu, cholera, yellow fever, and so on and so forth. They became, I'm old enough to remember the yellow WHO certificate, which actually said that I was vaccinated against yellow fever and I guess smallpox, if I remember correctly. And without that yellow certificate, I wouldn't have been able to travel at a very early age of my life. So that is going to fall in place, I think, during the remainder of the year, by mid 2022, most of these certificates are going to be mutually accepted by other governments. We in ACO, we are trying our best to convince the Arab League of States. Actually, I'm going in about less than 10 days' time for a meeting with them in order to convince them that to have some sort of a mutual acceptance policy so that, a vaccine issued by one country is accepted by all the others. But I would like to go back whether
Mr. Tefaha,
pandemic.
I'm actually curious on that question. If Thomas has something to say regarding not only the mutually acceptance of countries of those digital travel solutions, but based on the European experience and how you structured the different layers of risk within that certificate, do you see any risks for Europe as well? Not only from the technological perspective for your app to be mutually recognized in other regions, but also other countries imposing some conditions within those digital travel solutions that are basically based on vaccination, PCR tests, and immunity. I mean, I'm saying this based on the experience we have with COVID-19, when different regions, different countries have different approaches, and it's pretty clear that they're likely to repeat the same, but now through those digital travel certificates.
Yeah. So thanks, Marcelo. So in Europe, the digital certificate is a tool, nothing more than that. Member states would say. But it's a tool that puts national governments under pressure. Okay, we need to do something, right? So this is actually something people can use. And by the way, the hope is that most people will use it digitally, using their smartphone. But elderly people who don't have a smartphone, they still need to do it by paper. So the first positive thing is that we digitize it at least. Now, the second thing is that we can only hope, and this is going on right now, we can only hope that member states, because of the scientific proof, I would almost say, of the fact that you're vaccinated and that you can travel, or that you're immune or have tested negatively, that in itself is, legally speaking, not a binding measure for national governments to automatically accept, to reduce or to get rid of the travel restrictions. Because travel restrictions, remember, quarantines, that's one of the worst. The quarantines, the need to have a test if you're coming from country X, Y, Z. So unfortunately, what we see now, what we had feared, and we're going to write yet another letter to the ministers of health and the highest level at national level, in a plea to harmonize and to follow the European Commission's recommendations, which is basically saying, if you're coming from a green country, quote unquote green country, because in Europe you have this traffic light system, and green country means totally safe. So the recommendation of the European Commission is, if a traveler is coming from a green country, and can show with the digital pass, no problem, no need for testing, no need for quarantine. And so you have these different levels from the European Commission, which are quite liberal, but they're actually based on scientific data. What we see now, unfortunately, is that some countries, like my home country, Belgium, is kind of, I would say, accommodating because of the public pressure. People want to travel south, and they don't want to see the national government doesn't want to be seen as spoiling people's holidays. That's really what it is. It's because of the pressure from the public. They are, for instance, Belgium is providing free tests, free PCR tests in case you're traveling. So in case of tourism travel, summer holidays, you are entitled to 2 free PCR tests, which actually allows you at least 1 or 2 trips. Now, it doesn't mean that France, for instance, France has a different interpretation of the traffic light system, right? So what happens is that if you're leaving from a country, say Belgium, for the simple purpose here, it really depends which country in Europe you're traveling to. So even though they accept the digital pass, they may still have additional travel restrictions for you in place if you're coming from a red or an orange country. From a green country, I think it will be difficult to argue. But you see that for France, for instance, Belgium will turn green very quickly. I'm supposed to travel mid-July to France. So I'm really curious to see that, assuming that I'll travel from a green country, Belgium, into France, right now, I need a PCR test in addition to my digital pass. And, you know, it's technical because the reason is that I cannot prove I need to be vaccinated. I need to be 2 weeks vaccinated. So I will just not be vaccinated because I'm going to be vaccinated the second time on the 12th of July. It's the week after that I'm traveling. Tough for me. I still need a PCR test separately because obviously I'm not vaccinated according to the rules. But also other countries, I think, I'm afraid that's what we see now, they are still imposing additional measures because they can do. And so my earlier point was, I mean, the best thing that could happen for us is that the politicians, under pressure from the public and A4E, is that they actually conclude that in because of all what we've learned and because we have a pretty good European system, let's make that binding for everyone. And the next time we come across a pandemic-like situation, let's take on the European rules, please, for next time. But so we will use the experience and the pressure from the public and the media to the national politicians on the national governments. We will use that now. That's our next phase in order to guarantee, because there will be a next time, unfortunately, as also Abdul said, there will be a next time. And I think also George mentioned it, that at least then we have a harmonized one solution for all, again, based on scientific evidence. So there need to be certain conditions in place before we can then apply what I would call now the EU solution, including a digital certificate. But again, you need to be vaccinated, or you need to be immune, or you need to have a negative test. If any one of those 3 conditions are in place, you should be able to travel. That's what we're going for. There's no guarantees, and I'm afraid we are seeing some disparate, uncoordinated developments in some member states interpreting travel restrictions in a different manner, unfortunately.
So, on that point, Thomas, are all member states in the European Union behind a full comprehensive definition of fully vaccinated, or what is the current definition of fully vaccinated? George mentioned the case of Canada, where only 4 vaccines are recognized. So if you took any other vaccines that are not in that list, then you're considered not fully vaccinated, in which case you cannot enter the country. What's the situation among member states in Europe?
Well, so there is an agreement amongst member states on recommendation of, again, the European Commission, that the vaccine needs to be recognized by the EMA, the European Medical Agency. So I think it's similar than in Canada. So for instance, Sputnik, for the moment, the Chinese vaccine, the Cuban vaccine is not being approved yet by the EMA. So it needs to be an EMA approved vaccine. So I think it's the same logic as in Canada. So I think, we've got, the Pfizer's, we've got like 4 or 5 vaccines that are recognized, and member states have recognized that you need to have that vaccine. Hungary, for instance, is an issue. Hungary has used the Sputnik vaccine as probably only as a sole source of vaccination, because of their nice ties with Russia. So no one is saying that Sputnik doesn't work. It just hasn't been recognized by EMA. So I think if you're coming from Hungary or you're a Hungarian, I think you might have an issue, for instance, to travel within Europe because Sputnik is not on the list so far. Okay. So it's constantly evolving.
Okay. Now, another question that came up as well when I was listening to all of you is the question of how do we strengthen international institutions, ICAO, just to be clear, On one side, what can national states do to support ICAO in strengthening the harmonization process, but also what can the industry do to support that process? Because I mean, let's be honest, we're going through a geopolitical realignment right now. We don't know how things will end up in 10, 20 years from now, but there's definitely geopolitical tensions and a certain level of realignment. And that usually comes at a price of weakening international institutions because different countries are using them for different purposes. So there's less space to consensus, harmonization, and coordination. So maybe very quickly, if each one of you can give me a couple of ideas on how you think first the industry can contribute to that, and if there's anything to do, and what can the industry do through their national states to actually support that, which is, I think, crucial for the way forward. I will start with Subhas first.
Well, I think it is not up to the industry. The industry is very much on all fours with international organizations, ICAO and WHO. The whole process of the CART recommendations for air travel, the industry was a large part of it. It was part and parcel of it, you know. And the industry has always followed the WHO guidelines. The problem is that big countries have completely ignored the ICAO and WHO recommendation. That's why we are in the spot that we are in. Talking about vaccinations, I mean, WHO has made it very clear that vaccinations should not be required for travel. What vaccination does, it immunizes populations so that they can receive visitors. It's got nothing to do with air travel at the moment because transmissibility is not controlled by vaccination at the moment, or at least not proven to be controlled. So what we need is really to go back to the basics. All right, we are here today having such a strong aviation industry because of ICAO. ICAO set it up after World War II, and we had Chicago Convention, and that's why we have air travel. You know, so we have to respect and support the international organizations that have been set up by the states. That is very important. And secondly, we have to follow the science. And the chief of all the scientists when it comes to health matters is WHO. You know, so this has to come from the governments, in my opinion.
Thank you, Subhas. Gonzalo, perhaps?
Well, in the same way I mentioned on the step back, on the momentaneous step back on the part of liberalization within the region, I think that the support and the leadership of the international organizations at this point is a momentary step back because we need to understand that the public was in fear, and the governments tend to hear their constituents and take those measures that they think that they are claiming for. And as Thomas just mentioned, for example, the reopening and approving the standards for starting travel again is because the people are requesting to their freedoms back. So I think that the industry is doing its part. IATA has done a tremendous job in promoting standards and common practices in the case of the pandemic. And I think that my perception is that people, in a way that they start to understand that they need to coexist with this virus because it's not going away, and we are also used as an industry to previous pandemics. This is not the first one. Abdul Wahab was very clear on that, and we need to remember SARS and H1N1 and MERS. They're not with the same impact as this one, but they impacted severely in several regions. And again, the standards and the leadership of international organization into play again. So I don't see that there is something that we will see fragmentation and disharmonization in the future. I think that once the people starts claiming for their freedoms back, freedom to travel, freedom to do business, we will see that the governments and the states will start to gather and to follow these common practices as a way to move forward and giving back the people what they want.
If I may, quickly, Marcelo, I know we're running out of time, but I mean, I'll go back to what I said earlier, folks. With respect to Subhas's comments about it's not industry's issue, it's government. Governments are reactive by definition. They're very rarely proactive. 1. 2, industry needs to lead with proactive solutions and confidence building here as much as possible, as I said before. 3, in situations like this, global crises, people are afraid. It's a natural human tendency to want to withdraw into our national shells and say, we don't trust these institutions anymore. We don't trust these guys who let us all down, the WHO that didn't, put out the, we don't trust them. And we see that a lot in policy making now in Canada. We're doing our own decisions, guys. We don't care about what everybody else is doing. This will eventually smooth itself out. But again, we need to help build the credibility of these institutions. Again, we need to come forward with focused plans. So again, harmonization, globalization of the vaccination certificates and processes is going to be critical, among other things. Acceptance and harmonization, standardizations of vaccines, which are good, which are not. WHO has a lot of work to do to rebuild its credibility there. So again, this is where industry must pull and help along, because unless we regain as a sector, and including those institutions, the confidence overall of the people and of national governments that we are not going to kill them again in 6 months from now or 12 months from now, when Delta B2CZ6 variant all of a sudden is what we start saying to each other in our sleep. Well, we're never going to get that confidence back and that coordination back in our institutions.
Mr. Tefaha, reaction?
Yeah, George, I agree with you in general, but we didn't kill anyone. Actually, if we take, I agree with you. The first, patient 0 from patient 1 who traveled to Italy and then started spreading, that happened because of us. But once we knew that there is a virus and it is contagious, it's different than the, SARS and so on, or it's a variation which is more lethal. The measures we have taken actually produce almost 0 infections during travel. So as far as aviation is concerned, we are safe. We have proven that time and time again, once we have identified the threat. Now, the problem with those politicians who said, we want to go back to our comfort zone, close national borders and so on, they were the same ones who actually started saying that we will control it. It's not going to be, to affect us. It's not harmful, and so on and so forth. And they ended up killing 600,000 plus of their citizens. That's the burden goes on those politicians, not on the industry, which was extremely vigilant in trying to contain the spread of the virus. Coming back to your point, Marcelo, I believe that the international organizations, associations, regional ones, we have worked really hard. I can tell you, the first meeting we did with IATA, ICAO, and the Arab Civil Aviation Organization, it was April 2020. And we started then advocating for digital certificates, for the traffic light system, for so on and so on. But the problem with government organizations is that they move very slowly because they move by consensus. And once they decide, they don't decide. They put guidelines. However, having said that, I think the current experience of what happened to the economy I'm sorry for the toll of that pandemic, but many governments try to deal with it in a way which is, it's like scorched earth policy, destroy the economy, kill the people through poverty and hunger, but don't kill them through the virus because somebody is going to blame us for the virus. They will not blame us for hunger and poverty. I don't think this is going to happen again, at least in the short-term future, because
we have a couple of minutes just before closing.
Yeah, because people will continue to remember what happened during this pandemic. 100 years from now, it's a different story. I believe that international organizations, if they move quickly, international associations and regional ones, industry bodies, if they move quickly enough and advocate very plainly what they want and what they need, I think they will have an impact, because the traveler public and the governments recognize that the wheels of the economy, we are a major lever for that economy, and for the wheels of the economy to move, they need us.
Thank you, Mr. Tefaha. Thomas, any final comments on the European perspective?
Yeah, just very quickly. Thanks, Marcelo, and I very much agree with George and Abdul on this. I think we're a global business, and whether we're talking pandemic, whether we're talking the challenge to reduce or the challenge of global decarbonization, they're two good examples of global challenges which we need to tackle globally. And if we wouldn't work with international organizations, although slow they may be in the beginning of the process, maybe the outcome always needs to be a global standard somehow. It would be a big mistake. With the people around the table, that's our job, I think, to work with international organizations. I think what you can do is knowing that UN-like type organizations are extremely slow, and as Abdullah said, they give recommendations. It's very difficult to get some binding stuff out of there. And they're very slow, too late to be responsive for pandemic-like situations, if new situations, is you can start regionally, and you can start regionally what we've done in Europe, because we had no choice. Things were going too slowly. So try to get a regional solution and then use that to lobby at the international diplomatic level and say, well, let's use the US solution, or let's use the European solution. Of course, always knowing when you work at the regional level to make sure that there is an opening, to make sure it's compatible, interoperable with what the global solution will be. So you always need to work at two levels, as far as I'm concerned, regional, international level. But it would be, this is a business we're in. It would be a big mistake not to work with international organizations. That's for me a no-brainer. That's absolutely, so I'll stop here. So thanks.
Yeah. No, thank you. Of course, there's always so many things to discuss, so much ground to cover. Thank you so much, all the panelists, for your interventions, for your insights, your energy, and sharing, of course, your regional experience. I think in the past few months we've been talking a lot about global coordination, global harmonization, but we forgot that element so important, which is what is happening at the regional level, because the regional level is a bit closer than the national level, and that's where you can start coordinating things moving forward, taking into account that international institutions don't have binding powers on nation states. So I'd like to really thank you for an engaging conversation today. I'd like to thank our audience as well. I know it's the beginning of the summer. A lot of you are probably thinking about your summer plans. Hopefully, if your region is reopening and enjoying the summer that we didn't enjoy last year. So thank you so much for being here and attending this webinar this morning. And last, I'd like to thank the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy, one of Canada's leading think tanks, to partner with us for this event, which has global significance. I think we brought a very solid table around, solid speakers around this table, and we look forward to continuing this conversation with all of you. And since from now until then, I would like to wish you an amazing, wonderful, and sunny summer 2021 for those living in the Northern Hemisphere. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.